Thank you for joining us for this session on successfully transitioning your winery to new leadership. This session will have two parts. First, we'll talk to Peter Mondavi Jr. about how the Mondavi family has been transitioning their winery from generation to generation at Charles Krug Winery. And then we'll move on to a conversation about selling a winery and what that takes to get ready for. For that, we will have Mario Zepponi from Zepponi Company and Greg Brewer from Brewer-Clifton, which is now owned by the Jackson family wines. Thank you for joining us for this session on transitioning your leadership of the winery. First, we have to join us here, Peter Mondavi Jr. from Charles Krug Winery, the oldest estate winery in Napa Valley that's been in the Mondavi family now for over 75 years. And Peter is the third generation in the leadership here. So, Peter, thank you for joining us. I'm going to go straight in and say your grandfather, he passed away in 1959, leaving the winery to your father and your uncle to be the sole managers of that. And, that was a very different time back in the late 50s. And since then, the business has grown and your family has grown. And now you're into the third and fourth generation of being part of the family winery. What different roles do the fourth and your own third generation play in the winery today?
Yeah, well, it's evolved quite a bit since then. But first of all, Kim, I'd like to thank you for the invitation to speak to the group here, and hopefully people find it informative. But yes, it's changed quite dramatically. When my brother Mark and myself came in here, really kind of in the early 80s, late 70s, we just kind of like stepped into the winery and roles were formed and it was kind of organic and we just kind of evolved with the business. And but today it's become much more formalized, really driven by the fourth generation, the fact that we have 6 members of the fourth generation. Now, the two of us coming back in the 70s and 80s was a little bit easier than integrating 6. So really went through a more formalization introduction, I guess, to the fourth generation. What does that mean? Really formalizing our governance structure and really moving more towards a very classic structure. Of course, we have the shareholders, which are the third generation and fourth generation. They're all shareholders. But then we inserted a more formal board of directors, formal meaning we have now 7 members. 2 of them are outside members, wine industry executives, very skilled, very experienced. And they've joined our board, as well as our president, Judd, who is a non-family member, has joined the board. So we've really formalized these positions. And today, Mark and I play more of a strategic role, very high-level role as both shareholders and board members. But we also do a lot of traveling. Well, we used to in the last pre-COVID, a lot of traveling, promoting the wines to not only customers, our distributors, but also the press as well. And that's how Mark and I have evolved to it. And now the kids, the fourth generation, they are all knowledgeable ambassadors of the wines, and they speak to them as they can, where they can, because they're scattered around the country, the world for that matter. Only one of them is fully employed here at the winery on the payroll. She's actually, Brianna's employed in sales, but all the others are not directly employed by the winery. 2 of the fourth generation sit on the board. My oldest, Lucho, and Mark and Janice's oldest, Angelina, sit on the board. But as I mentioned, we're all shareholders here. So we've really formalized this process, and it may sound perfect, but we're still working at it.
So from the time when you and your brother entered to now integrating the fourth generation, did you have some deliberations about how you were going to integrate the next generation? So you made it a real deliberate way of doing it?
Yeah, it was awkward at the beginning because we really didn't address it. And then it became apparent the need to really address it. And we did a variety of things. We actually developed an advisory board, not a formal board, but an advisory board. The formal board prior to this was a handful of family members. So we developed an advisory board with some outside members. And then we actually incorporated a family business consultant to come in and kind of assess the situation and make recommendations to what to implement here. And a couple of things was first of all, education is very important. And when I say education, what does that mean to be a shareholder, an owner of the company? What are one's responsibilities in that position? As important, what are one's limitations in that position as well? So there's an education process. And again, it's an ongoing education process as well. And then the other one is governance structure. We had a very tight meaning very small governance team. My brother and myself, and then we had our CFO was kind of it. And then of course with Dad. But then as we expanded, we get the increase the number of fourth generation. We had to go to more formal governance structure, which I alluded to. So obviously we had the shareholders, but really formalized the board. So we went from an advisory board to a true fiduciary board in that movement. And at the same time, developing a more formal executive leadership team from the president down to the vice presidents of the various marketing, sales, HR, operations, things like that. And they came in, and they came in at various times, but they're actually all non-family at the president and ELT level. So that was a bit of a change for us as well. But those are some of the things we did to help integrate the fourth generation in. And again, I can't emphasize, it's a work in process. It's an evolution. And 10 years from now, it may look a little different.
When you say it's a process, is it something that you have like a regular review of how you're doing, or is it just when things come up, then you review it?
I think it's really more how when things come up, issues present themselves to the board, we rely heavily, perhaps excessively, on our outside independent board members, but I think they're very, very important on the input here. But I would like to think it's formal, but it's more informal. And as things, questions, issues, whatever bubble up, it frequently ends up in the lap of our independent outside board members to be an independent view of the situation. Because you want to get family involved, it's hard to keep your objectivity. So that's why it's important to have. And they don't need to be outside board members. They can be outside advisors. They could take various forms. This is just how we've chosen.
Yeah. So do you have a policy of encouraging family members to be part of the business, or maybe certain requirements to step in and have a role in the business?
First and foremost, for my wife and I, with our two kids, we are neutral with respect to encouragement of coming into the winery. We really want to push them, and I think we've done a good job, proud parent, to push them to go outside, to develop themselves, to get away from the safety net that a family business can offer. So our son is the oldest of our two. But graduated with a master's in engineering, loved automotive stuff. And so I went to northern Italy to work as an engineer in the automotive sector over there. He did that for 4 years. And now he's at business school on the East Coast. So he now wants to transition to business things and probably consulting. And our daughter graduated about 3 years ago in applied math, believe it or not. But she loves cooking. So she ended up in London at a food-oriented company there, but using her math skills for analytics, social media, things like that. So we continually push our kids to really evolve themselves. However, with that said, we are constantly educating them on the winery, the business, our wines, so that they, as shareholders, they have an appreciation and they can also talk about the wines. In fact, our daughter, who's currently based in London, has worked with our importer over there, representing us from time to time. So again, we want to push them to develop their own personal identities. And over time, if they want to come in and there is a appropriate position, then that can be reviewed.
Right. So for your daughter, she's got an independent career outside of the wine business, but then she comes in and plays like an ambassador role for in Europe.
Correct. Mainly right now in the UK, because that's our export market there. And our son did a similar thing because we're looking at some partnerships over in Italy, and so he actually visited some of the wineries because he was living there and speaks the language too.
Very good. So with all the multiple branches and generations of the family being part of the ownership, how do you balance ownership decisions? You talked a little bit about this with the board, but maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, it's we've developed this governance structure over the last, I don't know, 7-8 years. It's still a little bit of work in process, more on the education of all the shareholders. But we're trying to get to the point, and again, we're not perfect yet, nor will we ever be perfect, I don't think. But we're getting to the point where the shareholders, especially the fourth generation, get together and try to speak with a common voice, really to the board members. And because really the fourth generation are the recipients of the winery and actually have a majority shareholders in the winery. But the idea is to get their voice as a collective voice as possible to the board, and then the board would really take that and work with our president, who's on the board, and the ELT to move the winery in that direction. It's important to do that, and there's many different ways, family councils, things like that, depending on the size of your family business. But it's important to have some mechanism to kind of collect ideas and feed them to the board, because if each member of the next generation is feeding independent desires, wishes, thoughts to the board, then really it's up to the board to do whatever they want with a myriad of desperate thoughts, ideas. So it's good to have, in our case, the fourth generation, and we have one on each side to kind of spearhead this and talk together and try to get more of as much a unified voice as possible to the board.
Mm. Did you ever consider different ownership arrangements for the winery, like either selling it completely or doing a public offering of shares or anything like that?
For us, that's a pretty simple answer. We're either 100% family owned, or we're completely out of it, and that aspect was never considered. So yeah, that's why fourth generation is integrating into the winery, and we do have one member of the fifth generation who's probably maybe approaching a year old. It's a little ways away from sampling wine, but
but there's a fifth generation on the horizon.
The fifth generation horizon, which is a bit of a rarity here in California, the U.S. Europe, it's a different story altogether.
Yes. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about integrating multiple generations into the business. What are some of the advantages you see, both from the business perspective, but also from a personal perspective?
So integrating, especially the next generation, the fourth generation, their ages are from the 20s into the 30s. Incorporate them. First of all, I think it adds freshness. It adds a new perspective into the business, into the operations there. Also, it's reinforcing and really invigorating to both our employees and to our distributors, which are very key partners in our business. And we've been with these distributors for number of them, 50 plus years. And they just love to see the continuity of a family business, because in the dynamics of consolidation and wineries buying out other wineries, wineries within a distributor portfolio kind of come and go depending on who owns them, who buys them, and what the distributor alignment is of the acquiring company. So I think it's great to have that for not only the stability for our employees, and they see us on a regular basis, maybe not every one of us, because one's in Massachusetts, one's in Arizona, one's in London, but they do see a number of the family members on a regular basis here on property, and I think that's really, really reinforcing. And also to integrate them in whatever fashion, meaning the fourth generation in our case, even if they're not working here, they're around here, they talk to employees or whatever. I think it allows for a smoother transition, because the next generation is more up to speed on the business and what it is and what it looks like.
And so I know that your kids are not, in the business on a day-to-day, but for you personally, just having them involved and be part of the business, and of course, when your dad was still there, how was it on a personal level to work with your family like that?
There's, as I think everyone knows in a family businesses, there's pluses and minuses. There's high points. There's challenges. Sometimes we butt heads on things, and sometimes we agree. But I think net, it's great to be in a family business, and there's so many successful ones here around. Well, not only Napa Valley, but around the country and all kinds of sectors. But I do think it's at the end of the day, it's very well worth the some of the hassles and hurdles one has to go through.
Yeah. Maybe just with your own father, I imagine it was very rewarding for you to be able to work so closely with him all the way, to the end. I understand he was part of the business, maybe not full time, but all the way to the end almost.
Yeah, he was well active, well into his 90s. So he had a presence, and he started here. Well, he started here right after the war, so he started, I think, 46. And so he was the winemaker for many, many decades. And he was always inquisitive, experimental, seeking out quality. His focus, his love, his passion was on winemaking. Kind of the business side, obviously he did it, but that was kind of secondary. His love was winemaking.
Hmm. So I imagine it also been interesting for you and of course for the other people in leadership to have the very long perspective backwards that he had to bring to the business as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many people that worked with him, under him, that, I hear from today. Some people have left, retired, whatever, and they just are so appreciative to have had the opportunity to work with them, to work with a Napa Valley winery icon. Because he started when it was, it was a pretty rudimentary business in the early days, and probably less than a dozen wineries here, as opposed to almost 500 bricks and mortar wineries today. So, he was a bit of a pain sometimes with what he asked and things like that. But I think there is a very unique appreciation for him and his focus and dedication. And I think his passion, as I mentioned before, really spread to many of the other people, and also left an imprint on our winemaking style, which still exists today. So we're not some faceless corporation or anything. The whole family, all the generations active now, are very passionate about the business, and we really, we carry on this style that he developed over many decades. Obviously, we evolve it a little bit here or there to take advantage of what the grapes are offering, how they're changing in the vineyards, the trend out there. But there's an underlying call it the house style or whatever you want to refer to it, that permeates the winery that he left with us.
Great. So here towards the end, want to ask you: do you have some key pieces of advice for wineries that now are maybe looking at transitioning their winery into the second or third generation, and maybe things they should consider or think about when thinking about that?
Yeah. So kind of maybe wrapping up much as what was said here in bits and pieces, start now. I don't care what age the next generation is. Start now. And what I mean by that is education. Education about the winery or the family business, if there's non-winery members tuning in here. Just educate the next generation on what it is they have or they may inherit, and not in a way that would encourage or dictate them to, you must come on board. I think it's in the sense that if they may be becoming part owners, they should understand that and their position in the winery. And as they get older and can appreciate it, start getting into the governance structure. As a shareholder, what are your duties? What are your limitations? And part of that is, I think, given in good governance, but largely not understood if you're not taught, but given. But also, there's a lot of decisions to be made as to what you can define how a shareholder should behave and responsibilities. It's not, every company just doesn't have the same set of rules for that. And also install a robust governance system plan. And there's many different models out there. Ours is pretty classic: shareholder, board of directors, which is both family, non-family, with outsiders. We have 4 family members on it, and 2 independent outsiders, and our president, who is non-family. But have a more of a formal governance structure, and then your executive leadership team who reports to the board. In this case, it could be family, it could be non-family. Some family businesses say it has to be a family member leading it. Some say no. We in this case, we say no. It's kind of transitional. We hope in the future, once our current CEO retires, that maybe there will be a family member that would step in subsequent generations, but it's not mandated. But that's a decision each family needs to make, whether they want family there or not. Our real view is, may the best person sit in that position. If the best person is an outsider or someone within the company that's growing up who's a non-family, then great. If it's a family member, great. But it has to be the best person for that position, the most qualified. The other thing is here, go outside the family, get independent. As our example, independent board members, preferably at least one or several that have been exposed to family business, because if they come from private equity or something else, public companies, it's a heck of a lot different than a family business. So to have some members that have some exposure to family business, I think is very important. We used an outside family business consultant to come through and kind of assess this and help us with our governance structure here and the education side of things. There are numerous family business seminars out there, outings that are 1, 2, 3 days long, and I emphasize it's great to have as many family members attend these as possible. Reason being is we may think our problems are unique to us, but as I've gone to these different family business seminars, there is so much in common. And it doesn't matter if it's in the wine business or candy business or whatever business, there are so many parallels in family business and the challenges and the successes that come from getting together and talking with these other experienced people. So that's very, very beneficial. And the other thing is, I've talked about a pretty traditional governance structure. You go to these events and you'll hear many different variations of governance structures, many different opinions. And I think it's great to hear these different opinions. So seek out independent people, especially those who've had exposure to family business, I think is very, very beneficial. And another thing that I kind of like to close on is we've really talked about the family side of the business, the governance side of the business, next generations coming on board. There's a whole other aspect of generational transfer of a family business, and that's the estate planning, the financial side of things. So you really have to do both. Otherwise, you risk losing the company or the opportunity to successfully pass it on to the next generation. If you don't do the estate planning, then with the state taxes and everything else, you may end up being forced to sell the company. Dad did an extremely good job on that side of it for us. Not as good a job on the governance side. So really it fell on the shoulders of my brother Mark and myself to kind of pick up the pieces and then do all this governance restructuring or development, I should say, since it wasn't really in place, the latter years of Dad's life here.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, thank you very much for coming here and sharing about what you are doing at Charles Krug and in the Mondavi family. We'll look forward to keeping an eye on you and that the fifth generation on the horizon. But thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, Kim, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the talk.
For this next part of the conversation, we're going to talk about selling your winery. And to do that, we have with us Mario Zepponi, the principal at Zepponi & Company. They're experts in beverage alcohol mergers and acquisitions. And we have Greg Brewer from Brewer-Clifton, winemaker and founder there. He has sold his winery, which is now part of Jackson Family Wines. Thank you guys both for being here.
Thank you. Good morning.
Mary, we're going to start with you to give us a quick overview of things that people should think of when they're considering and planning to do a sale of their winery.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. And maybe it's best to illustrate this in a slide. So I'll bring up a slide here. When we go ahead and talk to prospective candidates that are looking at selling their winery, we go through a checklist. And it's not as exhaustive. It's more exhaustive than what this slide shows, but this captures really the most important salient elements of a sale process. And we like to say that really when somebody's thinking about pursuing a transaction, it all starts with value. No matter what, you have to have an understanding of value before you go into the whole sale process. Otherwise, there's bound to be disappointment, surprises, waste of time, and frankly, a large out-of-pocket expense to support all of the experts that you're going to need to go through a sale process. So one of the first things that we will do is we'll evaluate the financial statements of a winery. If the winery actually, has earnings. If not, we'll analyze the asset composition of the winery. But the way we look at value is we do three types of different approaches. We'll do an asset approach, then we'll do a market approach, and then we'll do an income approach. And again, all wineries typically have assets, even if they're virtual wineries, because they have wine inventory, bulk wine, and so as a result of that, those are still assets that would be factored into a valuation. Most of the wineries will have some real property component to it. So what we'll do is we'll take a valuation of that and put it into a bucket. And then for those wineries that have any meaningful earnings, we'll do the market approach where we'll apply some kind of a market multiple, such as earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, which is abbreviated based on this term EBITDA. And I think most people have heard of that term EBITDA. And then for those brands that are even larger, we will actually use a contribution after direct market spend multiple. And what we'll do is we'll look at current earnings, we'll look at projected future earnings, and we'll divine from that some type of evaluation range based on those market multiples. And then the third approach would be to use an income approach, which is where you're taking projected income for 3 to 5 years out, and you're doing a discounted cash flow analysis of it. It's largely dependent upon assumptions in the model. So that valuation could fluctuate, and it could be a little bit misleading on the high end and the low end, depending upon the inputs that you put into that model. Again, to kind of simplify it, I'd say the majority of the wineries, frankly, go by an asset approach, and that those wineries that have much more of a business component, earnings component to them will be able to introduce a market approach and an income approach valuation. And then what we'll do is, depending upon what approaches are applicable, we will kind of lay them out on a spreadsheet and, again, use a little bit of experience and art in terms of divining a valuation range and share that valuation range with a client. So that is fundamentally the first step before somebody should even be jumping into the market. And then the second step is to make sure that they are prepared for that whole transaction process with an experienced team that's going to be supporting that. And Greg, I'm sure you went through some of this stuff already, but it starts with having a good transactional lawyer, preferably that's very experienced with beverage alcohol transactions, and in particular wine industry transactions, because there are a lot of nuances and subtleties to a transaction involving a winery compared to any other business. Also, to have your existing tax advisor, and if a tax advisor is not necessarily well schooled in the wine industry, then perhaps seeking an outside tax advisor that can go ahead and function as, the advisor that's going to help steer the client with meaningful tax advice as you go through that process, because it's not as though you sell a winery, you sell a brand, you just get all the proceeds. There's going to be tax implications. And it's really important, the buckets that the net proceeds go into, meaning if you're going to have real estate assets, if you're going to have equipment, if you're going to have inventory, or if you're going to have this thing called goodwill, which is kind of a blue sky that you see when you sell under a market approach or an income approach, where there's a huge premium that can't be rationalized by giving it towards the real estate or the wine inventory. And so all of those buckets have different tax rates and tax consequences to them. The next step, as you can imagine, is that when you're taking a look at being prepared to go to the market, and this would be particularly applicable for those wineries that have meaningful businesses to them and they generate profitability and earnings. And that is to clean up the financial information. So sometimes clients say, well, why do I need to clean up my financial information? I file my taxes, I have my financial statements. And the response is, well, that's fine, but in order to go ahead and isolate some of these market multiples, sometimes you want to take a look at some of the expenses to say, are there any like one-time losses, for example, fires or lost inventory for various reasons? Are you overcompensating yourself or undercompensating yourself, where you have to make those adjustments to the financial statements only for the long-term benefit of making sure you don't have any hiccups during the due diligence process. The other component of kind of the packaging part of getting ready to go to the market is to look at intellectual property and permits. Very important. To start with, 20, 25 years ago, I'm not sure very many wineries paid attention to trademarking their brands, copywriting certain material. Today, everything, starts with looking at we call it IP, the trademarks, the copyrights, and all the other things that go along with that. So it's very important to make sure that there's been a review of trademarks and to make sure all the trademarks are current. And if certain brands or logos are not trademarkable, to be able to understand, is there any risk to a transaction by having something that's not trademarked, or is it, essentially a common law right that even though it's not trademarked, that an acquirer can go ahead and acquire the brand and at least take comfort in the fact that it's not trademarkable, period, but you still have a right of use to it. Similarly with permits, a lot of wineries are, fashion themselves as being very comfortable operating, let's just say, within a plus or minus risk range in their permitted capacities, where they may be having a permit for doing 20,000 cases and they're doing 22,000 or 25,000 cases, and being very comfortable with that because others are doing it. They're not creating any environmental issues or whatnot. But you have to understand, when you're going to the market, you're going to have a third party that is going to be very more likely risk averse because they're not familiar with the asset. They're not comfortable with maybe the local land use landscape. And so very likely what happens is, in those situations during due diligence, if they find that a permit is being exceeded, there's going to be an issue that needs to be reckoned with during that due diligence process. And in my world, when issues come up, it always costs dollars. So we want to avoid all that and be able to head that stuff out ahead of time before going into the market. And then lastly, this kind of dovetails into the last point, identify and resolve or disclose open issues. Ideally, all issues are resolvable before you go to the market, but sometimes there are issues that come up that you can't address or correct before going to a market. But what you want to do ideally is be able to disclose those upfront before going into the market, so that the particular buyer or buyers that you are dealing with know that, from the get-go, price that into their offer from the get-go so that you've really minimized the risk of having that initial offer being retraded once it's accepted during a due diligence process before you close. So I know I've given you a kind of a mouthful of information here, and I'll just pause. Greg, if you have any comments on any of that stuff with what you went through.
No, I mean, I think the outline is so beautiful and clear, and the way that you illustrated it all is perfect. And I think what's interesting from my perspective is that, and we can talk about the Brewer-Clifton situation later, but for us, we started this winery with $12,000 back in '96, and so there was and we did have two transactions. They were kind of close together in 2015 and then 2017, but it was interesting that the first one almost got us to the point of being able to get to your understand value line because it was very mom and pop. And I think, there are wineries that are set up as wineries and they're real businesses, and that's awesome. And then there are others, such as myself. I would put other, Seduri, Costa Brown, some others in that mix, where during the nascent period, it was very much like, oh, I've got some money. Oh yeah, I've got a couple grand. Let's do something, without even the awareness of, all of these things. And so it's really beautiful that you've got this, and it's almost like you have to almost get to altitude before even being able to engage in that quintet of circumstances. It was really beautiful and super helpful. I was taking notes myself. It was great.
Thank you, Mario. Greg, maybe this is a good time to just talk about the two transactions that you had, and maybe go a little bit deeper into how the first one helped you prepare for the Jackson purchase in 2017.
Yeah, of course. So as I mentioned, we started Brewer-Clifton with very humble capital, so to speak. Capital is a big word for 12 grand, but that was our starting seed. And then all the money, we just kind of got, put back into the business. And then, 3 or 4 years in, we were doing, we were well, received, and it was very guerrilla. We're selling wines out of our car, figuring it out, because, every dollar really mattered. And then I think late 90s, we splashed out, and Steve Clifton and myself, each got each other's cell phones. That was our first success moment. I had a blue one, his was red. And so that was that. And then the media kind of took off for us. And then before we knew it, we were leasing land. We had a small farming company. But it was really, it was almost like, trying to describe it like an artist painting in Paris or something, like on the riverbank, and kind of just working for bread and coffee and Beaujolais, and then all of a sudden, things kind of take off for you, but you go into it from a different angle, not from a business angle. As I mentioned before, it's kind of, I guess, more craft and artisan. And, I was 26 years old when we started. And so that's kind of how things went. And then along the way, so now fast forward 20 years later, and it was still the Cliftons and myself and my ex-wife at that point. So that was a little complicated. And then, but it was still built, the foundation of the winery was still very much, it was a little bit fragile, to be honest, because it started off like a partnership and a checking account. And then we kind of grew up from there. And so what was really beautiful with the first transaction that we solidified in 2015 was, it was a friend of mine, Ken Fredrickson, who is a master sommelier in Chicago, and he has a distributorship there. And so he reached out, and it was really great because, the valuation, I'm sure, was significantly less, or, less than it might have been had we gone into this whole equation thinking, oh, we're going to have this business and it's going to be worth X in 20 years. But it was, we were kind of getting by and it was all fine. And they were patient with the fact that, those 5 steps that Mario so clearly outlined, that was all super new to us. We didn't have any plan, our paperwork, our business plans were quite loose, and so it was really great. It was almost like a training wheels transaction in some ways. And not to speak pejoratively of it, but it was like, oh gosh, it was our first one, you're kind of, it's like you have braces on and you're in junior high school. It was kind of like an awkward first time doing it. And it really prepped us, because then with those partners, it became more of a real business. And so that was beautiful. And then we were more like normal. Whereas I think had we had a conversation immediately with Jackson Family, or had we worked immediately with a super prestigious, awesome firm like Zepponi, like it would have been like, okay, guys, like get your act together before you even come to it. You know what I mean? I kind of felt that way, and not in an insecure way, but just in a realistic way. We weren't tight. And so that kind of transition thing was very, very valuable for us. And then Jackson Family approached us. We weren't looking to sell again. We were in a good spot, and the partners were having fun, and we were making money, and it was all a very positive thing. And then Jackson approached us. And the prospect of working in the service of a company like that was a tremendous gift to me, to even consider that as far as a runway for the rest of my career. And so while the owners were pretty content of owning a winery and they're having a good time, and it wasn't like we were shopping for somebody, a suitor, so to speak. I kind of said, look, this is really meaningful to me in my career personally. And they're really, really kind people. And so they were, amenable to the conversation. And then from there on out, it was quite swift, because much like Zepponi, Jackson Family is well versed in making things happen like this. And especially for someone as small as I am, it wasn't some crazy headline grabbing metric. I mean, it was a nice, fair valuation of a small, well-intentioned business.
Just following up on that, Greg, you were saying how in the first position, you probably weren't really ready for a serious kind of the transaction like a Jackson takeover. Mary, is that something that you see with some wineries that are looking to sell, that they're just not really ready, or they will need a sort of a runway to get there before they have their business all the business assets lined up correctly to?
So ideally, everybody has the time to prepare for a sale. I hate using the analogy, but it's the perfect analogy, because everybody can understand, living in a home. And if you decide you want to sell your home someday, don't you want to, if it needs a paint job, don't you want to paint it? If it needs new carpets, don't you want to go ahead and put new carpets in it? Don't you want to kind of clean it up before it goes to the market, so that you have a better chance of driving and maximizing value? And that's probably the perfect, even though I don't like that analogy, it really is the perfect analogy when it comes to selling any business, let alone a winery.
That's a great analogy.
Hey, Greg,
Yeah.
I'm curious for, and you weren't looking for the sale, that second sale to Jackson Family Wines. Why were they knocking on your door? Why do you think they were knocking on your door?
Well, I think, at the risk of sounding, a whisper arrogant, I mean, I think they were looking to solidify a presence in the Santa Rita Hills appellation, to which I've devoted my entire career in the past 32 years. And it was kind of during that period where they had 4 acquisitions. Sounds so cold, 4 purchases, so to speak,
yeah,
of comparable types of things. Copain, Penner, Siduri, myself was like the 4th in that string that was relatively brisk during that era. And so I think, they were just starting to develop a vineyard in Santa Rita Hills, and they knew that, we had 3 vineyards down here, small ones on leased land, but we own the vineyards outright. And a humble warehouse facility in the industrial part of town, and I think there was a track record, and they theoretically could have started a new brand and kind of developed it from scratch, but I think there was value in the name recognition and the personality element of the brand. More so than just coming up with a new one, so to speak, and the value. And again, the value that I bring to it. I mean, that sounds so arrogant. I don't mean it that way, but knowing that there was someone who had devoted their entire life to something and to making something work in a very steadfast, way over 25 years. And so I think, they elected to kind of reach out to us as a potential horse to put in that race. And I'd worked with them off and on through the years in a loose capacity, like purchasing some fruit from their Julius and Catherine's vineyards in the 90s. And, we crossed paths from time to time because they're so deeply rooted in Santa Barbara County, or we are, I should say, as Jackson family, and have been for decades and decades. And somewhat surprisingly, they didn't really have anything going on in Santa Rita Hills until me. And so it was also a very flattering overture from my perspective, knowing that, with all of their resources and the means and how careful they are with that selection process, the hand outstretched to me was beautiful. I mean, it was a very, very flattering, inspirational move.
Everything that you say makes a lot of sense. They have a lot of vineyard holdings down there in that Santa Barbara area. They don't really have any dedicated brands pre-Brewer-Clifton.
Cambria Winery in Santa Maria is very meaningful and large, but in Santa Rita Hills specifically, to your point, Mark, it's like there was nothing before.
Yeah, in that luxury, kind of that price point. And so it makes really a lot of sense. And we see this time and time again is that larger wineries, sure, they can create their own brands, but the time, the money that goes into trying to recreate something that's already established, already revered by consumers, is really difficult. And it's a lot easier to acquire. And especially when you have some of the synergies like Jackson family had with the production, with the vineyard sourcing already in play, it was kind of like a plug and play that made a lot of sense, whereas a win-win, for you, a win-win for Jackson family.
Oh, it's a perfect storm. And you've seen so many relationships. I can't even imagine every relationship that you've worked with, overseen, learned about, made happen. But in my case, it's almost like, I don't want to say uncanny, but the perfect storm nature of like the local kid and this business, this winery that, has been quite successful over time. And then now matched with their infrastructure is really beautiful. So now vineyard assets, as far as we have access to at Brewer-Clifton and Diatom, our little sister Chardonnay label, is like boundless, in Santa Barbara County because of Jackson family's commitment down here. Our little winery, it's very, very lean. It's very frugal. It makes money. It's a lean system, so that's very attractive to them. There's nothing frivolous or unnecessary in our environment. And then for me, not only do I take massive advantage of the sales infrastructure that they have globally that I didn't have before. There's a kind of a legacy plan that I never thought about before when I started this. I was never thinking about handing anything down to anybody. And I think something that is of interest, especially for small wineries, and I'm seeing it more and more, is that I guess it's fine, but a lot of people have, they might have started a winery in the 80s or 90s, and they've had this really nice arc of a career. And at the end, kind of as they're nearing retirement, some locally are just closing and ending. And there's something, kind of poetic about that, I guess. But if there's not anyone else to kind of carry the torch, especially smaller projects where the person is meaningful. There's that relationship of like the person and the personality and the brand. And brand sounds a little bit cold, but I think we all can agree. I mean, there's certain people that help to drive certain systems. And they can, kind of ebb and flow a little, but so, some of those, and now it's cool for me because while I never prioritized legacy and the ongoing nature of Brewer-Clifton, it's really cool thinking, wow, like in 20, 30, 50, 100 years, this company will be like nurturing that, and there's something really exciting about that.
So I know that you weren't looking for that second sale, but it just kind of begs the question, did you see it coming? I mean, did you see that there was a logical connection with Jackson family at all and kind of have a hunch at some point, I wouldn't be surprised if they would be interested?
No, what's interesting, Mario, is that we didn't see them coming necessarily. However, when the initial overture was made, it was like, oh my gosh, that would be like a match made in heaven. It seemed very obvious after they first not obvious. That also sounds arrogant, sorry. But they, once that happened, in 3 seconds, I like visualized the rest of my life, and not in the way of like, oh, let's have a transaction and I'm gonna ride off in the sunset, but like, wow, like the rest of my career, if I can devote it to this situation, that would be the most amazing, incredible thing, and everyone's gonna win if everyone, and it seemed very apparent, although we weren't looking for it and we weren't really expecting them.
Yeah. It's interesting because a lot of the time with what we do, we'll try and get a sense of who the ultimate buyer is going to be initially, just when we're talking to a candidate and trying to kind of give, again, going back to that preparation phase. If somebody has the time to go ahead and prepare their winery for sale, one of the things that's really a useful tool is to say, okay, who do you think, would be a good match for your winery from the world of commercial wineries, whether they're from the United States or overseas, and why? And if the answer kind of is a credible, practical answer that they kind of a good overlay, then it really comes down to answering that why and going into a little bit more of a deep dive to make sure is that as you're preparing for a sale, you continue to become more and more attractive, not less so. So, so if somebody, for example, just a kind of a random example, if somebody is going to be attracted to a direct-to-consumer element in the winery, well, probably not a really good idea to go ahead and launch, into the wholesale channel when, if you really feel like this pool of 2 or 3 or 5 buyers really would be acquiring the winery because of the direct-to-consumer program.
And I imagine then as well that when thinking about what kind of ultimate buyer, also you should think about what kind of role are you going to have? Are you going to be continuing on like Greg did, or are you planning on riding off into the sunset with a little bag of money, right?
That's you, Greg.
Yeah, no, that's the interesting thing. And I think, in general, people are motivated by like ownership or service. I get a lot of other things too, I'm sure, but like as far as very simple categories. And so, I know, especially starting with kind of an entrepreneurial spirit and someone, starting a winery and it goes well. And then if they were to align with somebody else, I think we see it commonly where, there's still that drive, there's that ego, there's that desire to like create something else. And so sometimes, there's a sale and people are like, oh, cool, that was a great life. I'm awesome. Like I'm good from here on out. I'm just going to hang out and play golf or whatever. And then some, take that little bit and then it's almost like they're like kind of chomping at the bit, to do something again on their own. After whatever non-compete era is going on and whatever. And then in my case, it's interesting. I'm not really motivated by ownership. And in fact, I find it kind of overwhelming and scary. And, over those 25 years, we had some real nail-biting, stressy chapters, as you can imagine in this line of work and, divorces and economic downturn and everything else. I mean, it was like skin of our teeth. I mean, it was either we were like making it rain and like we figured out the wine industry, or like we barely were surviving. And it was like this. And but then, once now I'm with this more buoyant kind of business model, i.e. Jackson family, it's really beautiful because I'm motivated by service. I've realized about myself. And so I love pleasing people. And if you're running your own small business, we all know how hard you need to work and kind of make things happen and be scrappy and stamina and gritty. And so applying that same mindset to, working for a greater corporation, they're like, oh my gosh, you do so much. That's so awesome. And I'm like, oh my God, that's nothing. Just wait, like throw the ball again. I'm like a dog in the backyard that like is drooling. And I just want to keep catching the ball and showing my kind of appreciation and pride. And so that too is really a perfect system. And that doesn't always take place. I think if there's a winery such as mine, to have someone then like be even like more committed. I mean, in the past 5 years, and it also I think matters a lot, the nature of the person purchasing, right? So again, I've only really had the experience of my partners for those 27 months who were very kind and supportive, and that was awesome. But with the Jackson family, that their management style is such that in the past 5 years now, the winery has never felt more mine. I've never felt more independent. I've never felt more supported. It just feels more mine than it did when it was mine. And I think that is also, again, I'm very prideful and like honored to be with Jackson family. And I don't mean for this to sound like an infomercial, but there's a way that they manage to really motivate people such as myself to want to stay on and to want, I'm treated great and it's so fun. And I think that's important for something like mine because, with some frequency, I think we do see in any industry, not just the wine industry, if there is that kind of personality behind something, and if there is an acquisition or alignment with a larger company, sometimes, not always, but sometimes the specific kind of cool, culty, edgy element of that brand sometimes gets numbed a little bit as it's kind of absorbed into something else. And in my case, if anything, it's become more kind of extreme and singular. And that's partly my personality, I guess, but also how they've gone about kind of, taking me on, so to speak. And then also, real quick, I don't want to monopolize things, but another thing that's of note is, with, Mario talking about, the preparation for a sale and everything else, I think, for a lot of people, again, this is speaking very specifically from like a small, tiny little winery kind of situation. But it's hard, sometimes it would be hard to like, secure people to prep things in a certain way. If you really need to sell your house because you kind of need to sell it because you're stressed or strapped, sometimes it's like, oh gosh, God, can we afford? Yes, it makes sense completely to recarpet and paint and kind of spruce things up. And and the valuation could go up, kind of exponentially more. It totally makes beautiful sense. And I love that analogy. But sometimes it's like, well, gosh, that means where are we going to get the money for the paint and the carpet and everything else? And so there's also, and I don't want to say there's like that kind of like pressure sale, but like, sometimes that's the case. And I think in my personal situation now, it's so nice because instead of this like fight or flight business where when it was mine, thinking about making payroll and rent and sales and everything else, now, like, because so much of that has been taken away or alleviated from me, it allows my brain to like not be in that fight or flight position anymore, but it's deeply like anchored in the creative, promotional, educational thing. And I think that too can be so healthy and is like beyond value if you think about it, depending on the players that are involved.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, you're describing kind of the conundrum of the private winery owner that has to deal with, the day-to-day challenges of running the winery, making fabulous wine, making money, being able to sell the fabulous wine that you make, and then, depending upon if it's direct to consumer or wholesale or both, and basically spinning a lot of plates and being able to sleep well at night and then grow it the next year and the next year and the next year. Yeah.
Barry, do you see the role of the current owner post-acquisition being something that's part of the conversations or in the acquisition conversations?
Yes, and then yes, and there's always a but, right? But yes, I mean, anybody that's going to be acquiring particularly a brand, but secondarily a winery that has a brand, normally is going to want that continuity of ownership and the face of the brand. Where we see that to be problematic is, and Greg kind of touched on it, is that if you're talking about a winery that's really fallen on some difficult times, and so that there essentially is eroded or no brand value, then there's likely not going to be a very welcome spot for the ownership in any kind of a transition, unless that is a key component to a sale. The second instance is that, there are some very successful brands that are, the works of genius minds that are not necessarily, we call streetable. So that don't really want the owner to be out there if you're a larger wine company, but you definitely want the brand and you want to continue the brand. And so in those cases, you would probably see that they're just, the acquirer is very happy and content to just have a seamless transition and not have the personality of the former owner involved in any post-closing activity. I think, Greg, you have some ideas of what you're referring to.
The liability factor. Liabilities and assets, right?
There you go.
Yeah, well, I guess that counts into that equation of what's an asset in the acquisition, right? Well, guys, I think we could continue this conversation for quite a long time further, but we do have limited time. So to wrap it all up, maybe each of you would just want to give a couple of key things you think people should think about if they are considering a sale, within the next 2 years, 5 years, whatever you think. What should they start thinking about now to accomplish that successfully? Mary, can you start on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that let me come back to something that I didn't really mention, but I think is really, really important in today's wine industry that really was not that important 25, 30 years ago. And that is the identity, where a winery, where their brand fits on a shelf. And I really believe that owners have to have that 10-second, 15-second elevator speech of what the identity of their brand is. And it really kind of involves 4 elements, in my opinion. It's, what is your varietal focus? I think brands that don't have varietal focus are destined to get lost in this marketplace and find it more difficult to exit. I think, what is your retail price point? Where is your kind of, center of gravity? So, and then thirdly, what's your appellation? And it could be a broad appellation, it could be a narrow appellation, but how does that all converge? And then fourthly, what's your primary sales channel? So how that would look is you take a look at a brand like Acosta Brown, very Pinot Noir focused, very, let's just call it Russian River, Sonoma Coast. They did, hop along the coast of California, but primarily Russian River, Sonoma Coast focused. Luxury price points, $75, $100 a bottle. And they were known for having mastered the whole art of rarefied air of how do you buy something you can't obtain. And so they were primarily direct to consumer channel, 90% approximately, with another 10% wholesale. By the time they sold a third time to TSG Consumer Products, which is now the owner of Duckhorn, and they were merged into Duckhorn. But that is a real crystal clear brand identity. And once you figure that out, then you can kind of graduate to, okay, who's going to buy me? But if you can't get that elevator speech down in 10 seconds, 15 seconds, there's deeper problems that you need to figure out, in my opinion, before you go to the market, unless it's just a simple real estate transaction. And then somebody's buying a winery, buying a vineyard, and then the brand is really not going to be, there's not going to be any value other than bulk wine inventory and maybe a sell-off, runoff of any case goods inventory. So there's, in my opinion, there's you got to go through that exercise. The earlier you go through that exercise, the better. In fact, you shouldn't even have to wait for a sales event to go through that exercise. You've been thinking about it. People that get into this industry, I think, need to start with that. Start with the end in mind. That Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I will tell you, it is a fabulous tenet to go ahead and begin with the end in mind. So that would be what I would leave the audience with here today, is that have a clear identity of who you are. Are you just real estate, or are you more? And if you're more, then you have to go into that brand identity checklist: varietal, retail price point, appellation, and preferred sales channel.
Excellent.
Yeah, those past 5 minutes, like I have chills on my. I mean, that was gold what you just shared, Mario. And I think I thought about so many things. Again, I was taking notes, but I think it's like anything, and I think with that reflection, self-reflection, going into a potential sale before kind of taking these steps with somebody, it's just like your own self. I mean, you're selling yourself, and people sometimes, I think, lose sight of that, right? And I think, and it's like looking at yourself in the mirror, like with a stark light on, much like the house analogy, going back to that. If you live in a house for a long time and you don't really see that the carpet is a little weird and the color might be, but you don't even see it anymore because you're so like, oh, that's my home and that's my thing. And I see that with wineries a lot too. There's kind of and I'm not faulting anybody, but you sometimes are more confident about your value or worth or attraction or attractiveness to somebody else than you might actually be. And I think, really, really kind of scrutinizing what you do as a message. And it's just like selling anything, and I, there's so much distraction these days with phones and everything else, and so much, saturation in the marketplace, shelf space, everything else, that message has to be so loud and clear. And, in our case, right, it was Chardonnay and Pinot only. We never wavered from a 4-mile stretch of land, never wavered, it's a very Brewer-Clifton, all neutral oak. I mean, nothing's ever changed. Our package has never changed for 25 years. And so in 5-10 seconds, it's like, okay, like take it or leave it. It's not, that's not for me to determine someone else's desire for me, but it's very clear. It's very disciplined. And I couldn't agree more. If, those other wineries where it's like, oh, we did this, we tried this variety, and then we went to that appellation, and then we changed packaging 5 times. I would think that from a buyer's perspective, it's like, gosh, like what are you? And in some ways, it's almost like online dating or something, thinking about someone to like ask you out on a date. I mean, thinking about who that person would be, and also knowing who you are, and I think what, there's so many things you said that were just genius, Mario. That was incredible. But I think almost, again, thinking about sprucing yourself up and thinking about what you do and kind of evaluating, oh gosh, maybe a sale is appropriate for us in the next few years. I would also maybe think that many businesses at whatever scale, after they went through that exercise, they might be so much better off. You know what I mean? It's like you paint your house, you put in new carpet, you kind of reflect on how you can do things better and tighter and cleaner. And then you might look around and say, oh, wow, this isn't so bad. Like, this is cool. You know what I mean? And that can be advantageous. I think a sale isn't always, the ultimate outcome for people. It can be an awesome one, as it has been for me.
You reminded me, going back to the analogy that I hate to use, but that HGTV show, Love It or List It, I mean, you get people to go ahead and say, I want to move, but you have a spouse that says, well, I really want to stay. And then they fix it up, and sometimes they move and sometimes they stay because they actually love it.
Yeah.
And you're pointing out the point of that is that once you kind of correct things that need to be corrected, sometimes it removes a lot of the clutter and the pain points of ownership. And it's much more enjoyable, and you actually are making more money as a result of it.
For sure. And then ultimately, just like, again, with people, to take this from HGTV to like online dating, but like when you're then composed and calm and not fight or flight, oh, we've got to sell this business, the wine industry is so hard. If you're like, oh, we're good, we've got this cool little business and we're doing all right, and we're less desperate, and we're kind of like confidently doing what we do, I would imagine, just like in a dating scenario, you're more attractive to people because you're not in distress and despair. You're kind of doing your thing and successful and making some money. And then, it's like, that's, the easiest way to get asked out is like when you're on a date, whatever the apologies are, but it's kind of that confident composure, I think, is also very valuable, or would be attractive to someone potentially coming in. And so kind of cleaning your act up, so to speak, and really kind of fine-tuning and identifying who you are so that you can sell yourself to somebody. And as you both mentioned, and also kind of identifying who that person might be, or a small pool of, the people that might go out with you. That's really the best advice. And then the rest should be pretty seamless, following the 5 main steps that Mario outlined when we got started.
That's excellent. Thank you guys both for sharing your experience and your expertise. It's been very enlightening. Thank you for being here, and thank you for everybody that watched and asked questions in the chat. We'll talk to you guys in the future too, I'm sure. Have a great day.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Greg. Take care.